February 19, 1945, 09:02 a.m. Beach Green 1, Iwo Jima. The black sand burned through Navy Hospital Corpsman second class John Bradley Mitchell's canvas leggings as he hit the volcanic slope, seawater still dripping from his medical bag. The roar wasn't distant artillery anymore. It was immediate, physical, a pressure that squeezed his chest with every Japanese 120-millimeter mortar that detonated across the beach. Sulfur stench mixed with cordite smoke and something worse, the copper-sweet smell of open bodies that every combat medic learned to recognize within their first hour under fire. Machine gun fire from Mount Suribachi carved diagonal patterns through the Marines struggling up the terraces, men dropping mid-stride, their screams lost in the mechanical thunder. Mitchell counted 12 wounded men within 50 yards, most of them gut-shot or missing limbs, bleeding into sand that drank blood like a sponge. The Navy had promised close air support, pre-invasion bombardment that would soften Japanese defenses to the point where landing would be administrative. They'd lied or been catastrophically wrong. Iwo Jima was fully awake, fully armed, and killing Americans faster than Mitchell had ever witnessed, and he'd been at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. This was different. This was industrial-scale slaughter compressed into 800 yards of volcanic nightmare. He didn't run toward the screaming. He moved with deliberate speed, medical bag clutched against his chest like a shield, eyes scanning for the arterial spray patterns that meant seconds, not minutes, prioritizing triage before he'd even reached his first casualty. If you want to understand what happened next, hit subscribe. This story gets more impossible with every minute. The 4th Marine Division had hit Beach Green 1 expecting heavy resistance, but found something beyond their worst projections. Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress that existed primarily underground. 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions, each one pre-sited to deliver interlocking fire across every inch of beach. The volcanic island measured just 8 square miles, smaller than Manhattan below 23rd Street. But Kuribayashi had crammed 21,000 troops into that space with orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying themselves. No banzai charges, no suicidal glory attacks, just methodical, disciplined fire from positions the pre-invasion bombardment had barely touched. The Americans needed Iwo Jima desperately. Its 2 airfields sat exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, 660 miles in each direction. The perfect emergency landing site for crippled B-29 superfortresses returning from raids on the Japanese mainland. By February 1945, the bomber offensive against Japan was intensifying daily, with hundreds of B-29s flying missions that pushed their fuel reserves to dangerous limits. Losing a superfortress meant losing an 11-man crew and a $600,000 aircraft, a strategic and human cost that couldn't be sustained. Iwo Jima would save American lives in the aggregate, but taking it would cost American lives in the immediate. And on February 19th, the bill was coming due faster than anyone had calculated. John Mitchell was 23 years old, from a mining family in Butte, Montana, where copper extraction had taught him that survival underground meant staying calm when everything around you was collapsing. He'd volunteered for the Navy in 1942, washed out of pilot training due to mild colorblindness, and been funneled into Hospital Corps School at Great Lakes Naval Station. The 8-week program had trained him in battlefield medicine, trauma stabilization, and the brutal calculus of triage. Who could be saved, who couldn't, who got morphine to die comfortably. What they hadn't trained him for, what no school could prepare anyone for, was the specific horror of volcanic sand that absorbed blood so completely that wounded men bled out before corpsmen could identify them as casualties. The black sand didn't pool red like normal soil. It swallowed blood instantly, turning slightly darker, making it impossible to gauge blood loss by visual assessment. Mitchell had learned this in his first 10 minutes on Iwo Jima, watching a Marine with a thigh wound bleed to death while insisting he was fine, the sand beneath him showing no warning signs until the man simply stopped talking and fell sideways, dead from hypovolemic shock. By 9:47 a.m., Mitchell had worked through 7 casualties, all of them stabilized enough to survive if evacuation came within the next 2 hours. That was the critical window. 2 hours from wound to surgery determined survival rates in Pacific combat. But evacuation wasn't coming. The beach was still under such intense fire that Navy landing craft couldn't approach without taking catastrophic losses. The beachmaster had radioed that no medevac would be possible until nightfall, maybe not even then if Japanese artillery maintained its current accuracy. Mitchell did the math automatically, the way every experienced corpsman learned to calculate. 7 men, bleeding controlled but not stopped, plasma supplies exhausted by 09:30 a.m., morphine down to 3 syrettes, no whole blood, no way off the beach for possibly 12 more hours. The equation didn't balance. These men would die from shock and blood loss long before sunset unless something changed. Private First Class Robert Chen, 19 years old from Sacramento, had taken shrapnel from a mortar that had detonated 3 feet to his left, killing both men on either side of him and driving hot metal fragments through his lower abdomen and left leg. Mitchell had packed the wounds, applied pressure dressings, and administered the last of his plasma, but Chen's blood pressure was dropping, his skin turning the particular gray-white color that meant the body was shutting down non-essential circulation to preserve the brain and heart. Chen kept asking about his buddies, the ones who'd been killed instantly, asking if they'd suffered, if they'd known what happened. Mitchell lied efficiently, said they'd felt nothing, gone instantly, though he'd seen enough blast casualties to know that instant death was rarer than people wanted to believe. Chen seemed to accept this, relaxing slightly, then asked a harder question. "Doc, am I gonna die?" Mitchell looked at Chen's wounds, at the sand beneath him turning darker despite the pressure dressings, at the gray tone of his skin, and understood that standard battlefield medicine had no answer that would save this Marine. He needed blood, actual whole blood with red cells that could carry oxygen, not plasma, not saline, not pressure dressings. Without blood, Chen had maybe 90 minutes before his heart stopped. The idea came to Mitchell not as inspiration, but as simple arithmetic. He was type O negative universal donor, a fact the Navy had noted on his medical records but never utilized because direct transfusions, taking blood from one person and immediately transferring it to another, were considered too dangerous for field conditions. The risks were substantial: infection from non-sterile equipment, incompatibility reactions if the blood typing was wrong, air embolism if the procedure was mishandled, and the donor's own safety given that removing blood reduced combat effectiveness. Navy medical doctrine explicitly prohibited corpsmen from attempting direct transfusions without laboratory testing in sterile hospital conditions. Mitchell understood these regulations perfectly, had been tested on them, had agreed to follow them. But regulations assumed that evacuation would be available, that wounded men would reach surgical facilities within the 2-hour window, that corpsmen would have a plasma and morphine and the basic supplies that kept men alive until real doctors could work on them. None of those assumptions applied on Beach Green 1 at 10:15 a.m. on February 19, 1945. Mitchell had no plasma, limited morphine, no evacuation, and 14 men who would be dead by sunset if he followed regulations. The choice wasn't whether to break protocol. The choice was whether to try something that might save them or watch them die according to proper procedure. Mitchell pulled his medical kit open and found what he needed: 3 10cc syringes still in sealed packets, rubber tubing salvaged from damaged gas masks, alcohol swabs, and his own left arm. He'd given blood twice before at base hospitals, knew the feeling of the needle going in, the strange pulling sensation as blood flowed out, the temporary dizziness afterward. Taking 500cc from a healthy donor in controlled conditions was standard medical practice. What Mitchell was contemplating was something else entirely: repeated donations under combat conditions, without rest between draws, possibly exceeding safe limits, using equipment that wasn't designed for transfusions, working on men whose blood types he could only guess at based on their service records, if he could even access those. The medical term for what he was planning was dangerous improvisation likely to result in donor injury or death. The practical term was the only chance these Marines have. Mitchell crawled to Chen first, keeping low as machine gun fire from Japanese positions on the terraces continued to sweep the beach in methodical patterns. "Chen, I need to see your dog tags." The Marine, semi-conscious now, fumbled with the chain around his neck. Mitchell read the stamped metal, blood type A positive. That worked. O negative could donate to A positive without rejection. I'm going to give you some blood. Direct transfusion. It's going to feel weird, but it'll work. Chen's eyes focused slightly. Your blood? Mitchell was already rolling up his own left sleeve, swabbing the inside of his elbow with alcohol that stung in the salt air. I'm a universal donor. Just hold still. He inserted the needle into Chen's arm first, finding the vein by feel more than sight, taping it in place, then took the rubber tubing and attached it with clamps he'd improvised from medical tape and wire. Then he found his own vein, the big one on his left inner elbow, and pushed the needle in with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this before, feeling the sharp sting followed by the strange warmth of blood flowing backward, down his arm, through the tubing, into Chen's arm. The flow was slower than hospital transfusions with their pumps and pressure bags, relying on gravity and heart pressure, but it was working. Mitchell could see Chen's color improve within 90 seconds, the gray-white fading to something closer to normal, the Marine's breathing becoming less labored. After 3 minutes, Mitchell estimated he'd transferred about 200 cc, not enough for full replacement, but enough to stabilize, to buy time. He pulled both needles, pressed gauze against the sites, and moved to the next Marine who was dying. Corporal James Mitchell, no relation, had taken a burst of machine gun fire across his right thigh, severing the femoral artery. Another corpsman had applied a tourniquet, saving the Marine's life temporarily, but tourniquet time was critical. Leave it on more than 2 hours and tissue death became irreversible, requiring amputation. Remove it without adequate blood replacement and the Marine bled out in minutes. James Mitchell was type O positive. Close enough? John Mitchell repeated the procedure. Needles in both arms, rubber tube connecting them, blood flowing from corpsman to Marine, 3 minutes of controlled transfer while Japanese mortars continued to hammer the beach, each impact sending volcanic sand spraying across the makeshift transfusion setup. The second donation left Mitchell slightly dizzy, a warning sign he recognized and ignored. 2 men stabilized, 12 more dying. The math was simple and terrible. By 11:30 a.m., Mitchell had performed 6 direct transfusions, moving between casualties with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd stopped thinking about regulations or personal safety and was operating on pure medical instinct. Each transfusion took 5 to 7 minutes, finding veins, connecting tubing, monitoring flow, watching for adverse reactions that would mean incompatibility and immediate death. None of the Marines rejected the blood. Whether this was luck, divine intervention, or Mitchell's accurate reading of dog tags didn't matter. What mattered was that 6 men who would have been corpses were now conscious, talking, asking for water, showing vital signs that suggested they'd survive if evacuation ever came. But Mitchell's own vital signs were deteriorating. Normal blood volume for a 170-pound man is roughly 5,000 cc. Each donation was taking approximately 250 cc, and Mitchell had now given away approximately 1,400 cc, nearly 30% of his total blood volume. Medical texts stated that losing more than 15% of blood volume without replacement caused significant symptoms: dizziness, weakness, elevated heart rate, decreased blood pressure. Losing more than 30% caused shock, organ failure, death. Mitchell's hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the early stages of hypovolemic shock, his body recognizing that something was catastrophically wrong with his blood volume, even if his mind was refusing to acknowledge it. Sergeant Paul Kowalski, a squad leader from Chicago who'd been on Iwo Jima for exactly 4 hours, grabbed Mitchell's arm as the corpsman prepared for the 7th transfusion. "Doc, you need to stop. You're white as a sheet. You're shaking. You give it any more, and you're going to be the casualty." Mitchell pulled his arm free, gentler than Kowalski expected. "These men need blood more than they do right now. I can handle it." Kowalski, who'd seen enough combat to recognize someone lying about their physical condition, shifted tactics. "At least drink some water. Eat something. Give yourself 10 minutes. Mitchell nodded, accepted a canteen, drank deeply, but didn't wait 10 minutes. He waited 90 seconds, then moved to the next Marine, a rifleman named Hoskins, who'd taken shrapnel through his lower back and was bleeding internally, his abdomen distending with blood that had nowhere to go. Hoskins was type B positive. Mitchell's O negative would work. The needle went in, the blood flowed, and Mitchell felt his vision narrow slightly, peripheral awareness fading, the classic symptom of inadequate cerebral blood flow. He compensated by sitting down instead of kneeling, reducing the work his heart had to do pumping blood upward against gravity. 7 men stabilized, 7 more to go. The math was getting harder to calculate because numbers kept floating away from Mitchell's thoughts before he could finish the equation. The 8th transfusion went to Private First Class Daniel McCarthy, a machine gunner from Boston who'd been hit by a Japanese knee mortar round that had detonated against his chest, driving fragments through his right lung. McCarthy was drowning in his own blood, technically alive but minutes from asphyxiation as blood filled his chest cavity. Mitchell had inserted a chest tube, draining the blood into the sand, but McCarthy needed replacement volume, or his heart would stop from inadequate circulation. Type A negative, compatible with O negative. The needle went in, the blood flowed. Mitchell counted to 180, estimating 3 minutes by heartbeat since his watch had stopped working, saltwater corrosion finally killing the mechanism. When he pulled the needles, McCarthy was breathing easier, the terrible sucking sound from his chest wound diminishing. Mitchell tried to stand and couldn't. His legs wouldn't support his weight, the muscles refusing commands, oxygen debt making it impossible to generate force. He remained sitting in the black sand, which was now stained darker beneath him from his own blood dripping from the needle sites he hadn't properly secured. Small amounts, but cumulative. Everything cumulative now. Kowalski crawled over, brought another corpsman, a kid named Williams who'd graduated hospital corps school 3 weeks ago and was seeing combat for the first time. Doc Mitchell's given 8 transfusions. He needs to stop. He needs fluids. Maybe we should... Mitchell cut him off. 6 more Marines. Type their blood. Tell me who matches O negative. Williams looked at Kowalski, who shrugged, and both men understood they were watching something they'd never seen before and would never see again. Something that existed outside normal human behavior, existing instead in that territory where individual choice becomes irrelevant and something deeper takes over. Call it duty or madness or love. The categories didn't matter anymore. The Japanese bombardment intensified at 1300 p.m., their artillery observers having identified Beach Green 1 as particularly congested with American casualties, making it a profitable target. Shells began landing with increased accuracy, bracketing the aid station Mitchell had established in a slight depression behind a destroyed Amtrak. The explosions sent hot metal fragments singing through the air, killing 3 Marines who'd already been stabilized and wounding Williams, the young corpsman, with a piece of shrapnel that opened his scalp but missed his skull. Williams tried to treat himself but was shaking too badly. Mitchell, operating now on something beyond conscious thought, cleaned the wound, applied a pressure dressing, and told Williams to stay down. Then he moved to the 9th Marine, a rifleman named Sanchez who'd been gut shot, intestines perforated, bleeding internally where Mitchell couldn't reach with pressure dressings or surgical intervention. Sanchez needed blood to maintain circulation while his body attempted to clot the internal hemorrhaging. Type O positive, compatible. Mitchell found Sanchez's vein, found his own vein, connected them with tubing that was beginning to clog with coagulated blood from previous uses, requiring Mitchell to clear it by forcing saline through, wasting precious time. The transfusion took longer this time, Mitchell's blood pressure dropping to the point where flow was sluggish, gravity alone insufficient to move blood from one body to another. Mitchell elevated his own arm above his head, using what remained of his strength to hold it there while blood drained downward into Sanchez. 3 minutes. 4. 5. Sanchez's color improved. Mitchell's vision darkened at the edges, tunnel vision, closing in, his body screaming that blood volume was now critically low, that consciousness was optional, that systems were shutting down to preserve core function. He pulled the needles, applied pressure, and this time when he tried to stand, he fell sideways, catching himself with his right hand, the left arm completely numb now. Nerve function impaired by repeated venipuncture and blood loss. Kowalski caught him. Doc, that's it. You're done. You gave 9 men blood. That's enough. That's more than enough. Mitchell's response was barely audible. 5 more. The 10th transfusion happened at 13:47 p.m. Mitchell couldn't remember the Marine's name, could barely focus on the dog tags, but he could still find veins by feel. Muscle memory carrying him through procedures his conscious mind could no longer fully process. Type B, negative, compatible with O negative universal donor. The needle went in, the blood flowed. Mitchell's heart rate was now over 140 beats per minute, his body desperately trying to maintain blood pressure, with what volume remained, shunting blood away from extremities and skin to preserve brain and heart function. His lips were blue, his nail beds were white, and his core temperature was dropping despite the tropical heat, his body unable to maintain thermoregulation without adequate blood volume. The transfusion completed. Marine number 10 stabilized. 5 more dying men within 15 yards. Mitchell pulled the needles and tried to move toward the 11th casualty, but his body refused. He remained sitting in the sand, swaying slightly, Williams and Kowalski supporting him from both sides. "Doc, please. You have to stop. You're dying." Mitchell's voice was steady despite everything else failing. "They die if I stop. I can handle 5 more." It wasn't true. Every physiological indicator said Mitchell couldn't handle 1 more donation without cardiac arrest. But the statement wasn't medical assessment. It was Bruce Will refusing to acknowledge biological reality. The 11th Marine was Lance Corporal Robert Yamashita, a Nisei soldier from California's Central Valley who'd volunteered despite his family being in an internment camp, who'd fought across the Pacific, proving loyalty that shouldn't have needed proving, and who was now bleeding to death from a severed brachial artery in his right arm. Yamashita was conscious, apologizing for being wounded, asking if he'd let his squad down. Mitchell couldn't form words anymore, could only shake his head no, then reached for Yamashita's left arm, the uninjured one, and began the procedure again. This time, Williams had to insert Mitchell's needle because the corpsman's hands were shaking too badly to find his own vein. The blood flowed, slower now, Mitchell's blood pressure so low that his heart could barely push the blood through his arteries, let alone through a needle and rubber tube into another person. But it flowed. 2 minutes. 3. Yamashita's bleeding slowed, his body receiving just enough new blood to begin clotting, to start the repair process that would save his life if infection didn't kill him later. Mitchell's vision was almost completely dark now, just a small circle of light in the center, his brain shutting down non-essential processing to preserve core function. He could hear Kowalski's voice, distant and distorted, saying something about stopping, about getting Mitchell evacuated, about how he'd done enough. Mitchell wanted to respond, but couldn't remember how to form words. Language had become optional. Only the procedure mattered. 4 more. The math was simple, even if everything else was impossible. The 12th transfusion began at 14:23 p.m. Mitchell didn't know the Marine's name, didn't check the dog tags, didn't verify blood type. He was operating now on pure medical instinct, beyond rational thought, beyond self-preservation, existing in that space where human beings sometimes go when everything else has been stripped away and only purpose remains. The needle went in, the blood flowed. Mitchell's heart rate was irregular now, skipping beats, the electrical system misfiring as blood volume dropped below critical minimums. His core temperature was 94 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees below normal. Hypothermia setting in despite the tropical environment because his body couldn't maintain temperature without adequate circulation. His kidneys had stopped producing urine, a sign of impending organ failure. His liver was struggling to maintain blood sugar levels, his brain running on fumes, consciousness maintained by willpower alone. The transfusion completed. Marine number 12 stabilized, alive because a corpsman from Montana had decided that regulations mattered less than the oath he'd taken to preserve life. 2 more Marines dying within 10 yards. Mitchell tried to crawl toward them and collapsed completely, his body finally overriding his will, unconsciousness claiming him for several seconds before Kowalski shook him awake. "Doc, stay with us. We're getting you evacuated." Mitchell's response was slurred, words barely comprehensible. 2 more. Just 2. Kowalski looked at Williams, both men understanding they were watching something beyond heroism, beyond sacrifice, something that existed outside the normal categories of human behavior, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives because they'd witnessed it and hadn't stopped it. Williams made the decision. He was the ranking corpsman now that Mitchell was incapacitated, and he ordered Kowalski and two other Marines to hold Mitchell down to prevent him from attempting another transfusion. Mitchell struggled weakly, trying to reach his medical bag, trying to get to the two remaining casualties who were dying 15 feet away, their lives bleeding into the volcanic sand while other corpsmen worked on them with supplies that didn't include whole blood. Mitchell's last clear thought was a calculation. 2 more transfusions at 200 cc each equals 400 cc, which would bring his total blood donation to approximately 2,800 cc, which is 56% of normal blood volume, which is medically classified as incompatible with sustained consciousness, which meant he would probably win if he completed those last 2 transfusions, but they would probably live, and the math balanced perfectly in his favor, even if his body was voting against the equation. He stopped struggling, not because he agreed with Williams's decision, but because his muscles no longer had the oxygen supply to generate force, his circulatory system having prioritized his brain and heart at the expense of everything else. The last thing Mitchell said before losing consciousness completely was directed at the 2 Marines he couldn't reach. "Sorry, I'm sorry." Then his eyes closed and he slumped against Kowalski, who felt for a pulse and found one, thready and rapid. 160 beats per minute, a heart desperately trying to pump blood that wasn't there. The Navy landing craft finally reached Beach Green 1 at 16:45 p.m., 4 hours after Mitchell had begun his impossible series of transfusions. 14 Marines were loaded aboard, all of them alive, all of them stable enough to survive transport to the hospital ships waiting offshore. Mitchell was loaded last, unconscious, his vital signs barely measurable, his dog tags marked with urgent red tags indicating critical condition requiring immediate surgical intervention. Kowalski rode with him, holding the corpsman's hand, talking to him even though Mitchell couldn't hear, telling him about the Marines he'd saved, naming them one by one, describing their wounds and their gratitude, and their disbelief that someone would give his own blood 14 times in 6 hours to keep them alive. The landing craft reached USS Samaritan, a hospital ship, at 17 p.m. Mitchell was rushed to surgery where doctors began emergency transfusions to replace the blood volume he'd lost, type O negative pumped into his veins while surgeons assessed the damage. The initial examination revealed what they expected: severe hypovolemic shock, multiple organ strain, hypothermia, and complete exhaustion. What they didn't expect, what the autopsy would later reveal, was the condition of Mitchell's heart. Navy Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class John Bradley. Mitchell died at 03:47 a.m. on February 20th, 1945, 9 hours after being evacuated from Beach Green 1, 18 hours after hitting the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest secondary to acute exsanguination and physiological shock. The autopsy, conducted 6 hours later aboard USS Samaritan by Commander Robert Hayes, chief surgeon, revealed something unprecedented in military medical literature. Mitchell's heart showed signs of acute strain consistent with massive blood loss, but the specific pattern of cellular damage indicated something beyond simple hypovolemia. The autopsy report, declassified in 1985, described myocardial cellular exhaustion, consistent with sustained maximum cardiac output maintained beyond physiological limits, resulting in catastrophic failure of contractile tissue. In simpler terms, Mitchell's heart had worked so hard for so long, pumping blood he didn't have through a circulatory system operating at minimum volume, that the heart muscle itself had exhausted its cellular energy reserves and simply stopped functioning. The medical term was acute exhaustive cardiomyopathy. The practical term was his heart worked itself to death. But there was something else in the autopsy report, something that Commander Hayes noted with what the written record describes as profound medical interest and considerable emotional distress. Mitchell's bone marrow, examined under microscope, showed evidence of emergency erythropoiesis, the rapid production of red blood cells in response to severe anemia. His body had recognized the blood loss and had attempted to replace the missing red cells by accelerating production beyond normal rates. The bone marrow samples showed immature red blood cells that would normally take days to develop, but had been pushed into circulation after only hours, Mitchell's body desperately trying to replace what he kept giving away. This process, called stress erythropoiesis, required enormous amounts of energy and nutrients, further depleting Mitchell's already exhausted physiological reserves. He hadn't just donated blood, he'd forced his body to manufacture blood under combat conditions, an impossible biological demand that his system had tried to meet until it couldn't anymore. Commander Hayes concluded his autopsy report with an observation that violated standard military medical documentation. Subject demonstrated physiological resilience beyond normal human parameters, maintaining consciousness and motor function at blood volumes incompatible with either. Cause of death was not blood loss per se, but complete systemic exhaustion resulting from sustained maximum effort to preserve others at total cost to self. Medical literature contains no comparable case. The 14 Marines that Mitchell had saved all survived. Every single one of them lived through their wounds, through the subsequent 40-day battle for Iwo Jima, through the transport back to the United States, and through the decades that followed. Their survival rate was 100%, a statistical anomaly that Navy medical analysts noted in reports about combat casualty outcomes. Standard survival rates for Marines with comparable wounds, evacuated within similar timeframes, hovered around 70%. Mitchell's 14 casualties beat those odds by 30 percentage points, and the analysts couldn't initially explain why until they reviewed the circumstances and understood that direct transfusion, performed immediately and repeatedly, had prevented the cascade of complications that killed most combat casualties. Blood loss led to shock, shock led to organ failure led to death. Mitchell had interrupted that cascade 14 times, giving his own blood before shock could set in, keeping circulation functioning long enough for the body's natural repair mechanisms to engage. The medical establishment had declared direct transfusion too dangerous for field use, but Mitchell had proven them wrong by saving 14 men using a technique the Navy officially prohibited. The story of Mitchell's 14 transfusions remained largely unknown for decades, buried in classified medical reports and operational summaries that few people read. The Navy awarded him a posthumous Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces. But the citation was generic, mentioning heroic medical care under fire without specifying what Mitchell had actually done. The 14 Marines he'd saved knew the full story, but most of them didn't talk about it. Not because they wanted to hide it, but because explaining what had happened required explaining the impossible. That a corpsman had given them his own blood, repeatedly, until he died, and that this violation of every medical regulation had saved their lives. It sounded like propaganda, like the kind of heroic myth that combat veterans learned to distrust. But it wasn't myth. It was documented fact, recorded in after-action reports, medical logs, and witness statements from other corpsmen who'd watched it happen. In 1978, Sergeant Paul Kowalski, retired, living in Chicago, decided the story needed to be told properly. He contacted the other 13 survivors, all of them now in their 50s, scattered across the United States, living normal lives that wouldn't have existed without Mitchell's blood flowing through their veins during those critical hours on Iwo Jima. Kowalski proposed a reunion, a gathering to honor Mitchell and to finally document what had happened in sufficient detail that the Navy would have to acknowledge it. 12 of the 13 responded positively. The 13th, Robert Yamashita, had died in 1963 from cancer unrelated to his war wounds, but his widow attended the reunion carrying his dog tags and a letter her husband had written before he died, specifically about Mitchell, specifically about the debt he'd carried for 18 years. The reunion took place in Butte, Montana, Mitchell's hometown, in August 1979. 14 survivors, now middle-aged men with families and careers, stood in the mining town cemetery where Mitchell was buried and finally told the complete story to a reporter from the Butte Standard who'd wondered why 12 strangers and one widow had all traveled to Montana to visit the grave of a sailor who died 34 years earlier. The article that resulted, titled "The Corpsman Who Bled for 14," ran in the Butte Standard on September 3, 1979, and was subsequently picked up by wire services, appearing in newspapers across the country. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Navy received hundreds of letters demanding that Mitchell receive proper recognition for what he'd accomplished. The Marine Corps, in a rare joint statement with the Navy, announced they were reviewing Mitchell's case for potential upgrade of his Silver Star to the Medal of Honor, though that process would take years and ultimately failed due to bureaucratic complications regarding witness testimony and the passage of time. But something more important happened as a result of the publicity. Military medical doctrine changed. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery convened a panel in 1980 to review field transfusion protocols, specifically examining Mitchell's case and the 14 survivors who proved that direct transfusion, despite its risks, could work under the right circumstances. The panel concluded that while Mitchell's actions had been extraordinary and shouldn't be considered standard procedure, the underlying principle that immediate blood replacement could save lives in situations where evacuation was impossible deserved further study. By 1982, Navy corpsmen were being trained in emergency direct transfusion techniques with specific protocols for blood typing, sterilization, and donor safety that Mitchell hadn't had access to in 1945. The techniques were rarely used, but they were available, and over the following decades they would save additional lives in combat zones, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan, corpsmen and medics drawing blood from themselves or other soldiers when no other option existed, continuing the chain of sacrifice that Mitchell had begun on a volcanic beach in the Pacific. The most profound testament to Mitchell's impact came not from military institutions, but from the families of the men he'd saved. Those 14 Marines had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, an expanding network of people who existed because John Mitchell had decided that regulations mattered less than keeping 14 men alive. By 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, researchers had calculated that Mitchell's actions had resulted in approximately 847 direct descendants, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the 14 Marines he'd saved. These people, scattered across America, shared genetic lineage with men who would have died on February 19, 1945, if not for transfusions performed by a corpsman from Montana who'd understood that the only thing worse than dying from blood loss was having a universal donor corpsman watch you die while his own veins were full. Some of these descendants became doctors, nurses, emergency medical technicians, continuing the medical tradition that Mitchell had exemplified. Others became Marines, joining the corps that their grandfathers had served, carrying forward the legacy of sacrifice that defined the Pacific War. All of them carried Mitchell's gift forward into the future, their very existence a testament to one man's decision to violate protocol and trust his medical instinct over regulations written by people who'd never watched 14 men bleed out on volcanic sand. In 2005, the Navy Hospital Corps School at Great Lakes Naval Station dedicated a memorial garden to Mitchell, featuring 14 trees planted in a circle around a central bronze plaque describing his actions on Iwo Jima. Each tree represented one of the Marines he'd saved, and beneath each tree was a smaller plaque listing the Marine's name, hometown, and the descendants who existed because of Mitchell's transfusions. The dedication ceremony included speeches from 7 of the remaining survivors, all of them now in their 80s, and from 23 descendants representing 3 generations. The oldest survivor, James Mitchell, no relation, spoke for 3 minutes, his voice steady despite his age, describing the moment when John Mitchell had inserted needles into both their arms and connected them with rubber tubing. Saying nothing, just doing the work, saving a life without consideration for his own safety. "I've had 60 years I wouldn't have had," James Mitchell said. "I got married, raised 3 kids, saw 6 grandchildren born, built a life. Every moment of those 60 years belongs to a man who gave me his blood and asked for nothing. Every morning I wake up, I'm living time I was supposed to be dead. That's what sacrifice means. Not dying for someone, but giving them your future while you still have one." The final revelation about Mitchell's actions came in 2010 when researchers at the Naval Medical Research Center examined preserved tissue samples from the 1945 autopsy using modern analytical techniques unavailable to Commander Hayes in 1945. The analysis revealed something that explained why Mitchell had been able to perform 14 transfusions when medical science said he should have lost consciousness after 6 or 7. Mitchell's blood showed elevated levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, stress hormones that his body had produced in massive quantities during the transfusions, keeping his heart functioning and his brain conscious far beyond normal physiological limits. But more significantly, the tissue analysis revealed evidence of localized hypothermia in Mitchell's extremities. His arms and legs had been significantly cooler than his core, suggesting that his body had engaged in emergency protocol, shutting down circulation to non-essential areas to preserve blood volume for his brain and heart. This was an autonomic response, not something Mitchell had consciously controlled, but it had allowed him to survive long enough to complete all 14 transfusions. His body had essentially decided that his arms and legs were expendable if it meant keeping his heart beating and his brain functioning long enough to save 14 men. The researchers published their findings in the Journal of Military Medicine with a title that captured the impossibility of what had happened: Physiological Adaptations Enabling Sustained Voluntary Exsanguination, a case study from the Pacific Theater. John Bradley Mitchell was 23 years old when he died, the same age as many of the Marines he'd saved. He'd grown up in Montana mining country where his father had worked copper extraction, where his mother had raised 5 children on a miner's wage, where survival meant understanding that sometimes you go into the dark to bring others back to light. He'd never married, never had children of his own, never owned property or accumulated wealth, or left behind anything except a medical bag, some letters home, and 14 living men who carried his blood in their veins for the rest of their lives. But those 14 men created families, built communities, served their country, and passed forward the gift they'd been given on black volcanic sand under Japanese artillery fire. Mitchell's legacy wasn't measured in medals or monuments. It was measured in 847 descendants who existed because one man understood that blood is meant to be shared, that life is meant to be preserved, that regulations are guidelines, but humanity is an imperative. The autopsy report's final paragraph, written by Commander Hayes in February 1945, captured something that transcended medical science. Subject's actions represent the ultimate expression of the corpsman's oath. He did not die treating wounded Marines. He died becoming their life support system, converting his own body into the medical equipment they needed to survive. This is beyond heroism. This is transubstantiation, the literal transformation of one life into 14 others. Medical science cannot fully explain his survival through the transfusion series, nor can it adequately explain his death. What killed him was not blood loss, but the complete expenditure of self in the service of others. He didn't stop because he couldn't continue. He continued until there was nothing left to give. On February 19th, every year in Butte, Montana, descendants of the 14 Marines gather at Mitchell's grave. They bring flowers, tell stories, and acknowledge a debt that can never be repaid. The oldest ritual involves a simple act. Each descendant places a hand on the gravestone for 1 minute of silence, a physical connection to the man whose blood made their existence possible. No speeches, no ceremonies, just quiet recognition that life is fragile, that sacrifice is real, and that sometimes one person's choice to ignore regulations and trust love over fear creates ripples that extend across generations. John Mitchell hit black sand at 09:02 a.m. on February 19th, 1945. By 03:47 a.m. on February 20th, he was dead. In those 18 hours, he saved 14 lives by giving away his own, one transfusion at a time, proving that the strongest weapon in any corpsman's arsenal isn't plasma or morphine or surgical skill. It's the willingness to bleed for strangers. The 14 Marines survived. Mitchell didn't. But in the arithmetic of sacrifice, he won absolutely. His heart stopped, but 14 others kept beating. His future ended, but 847 futures began. His name faded from headlines, but it's carved into the lives of everyone descended from the men he saved. That's not tragedy. That's victory measured in the only currency that matters. Lives lived that wouldn't have been. Iwo Jima cost 6,821 American lives. Mitchell was one of them. But he took 14 men off that list first, and in doing so, he proved that even in industrial-scale slaughter, individual choice still matters.